We tend to picture colonization as a story about flags, gunships, and soldiers marching ashore. That's the version in most textbooks: conquest by force, territory seized, a map redrawn in someone else's color. But look closely at how many of history's most consequential colonial takeovers actually happened, and you'll find something quieter and, in some ways, far more effective than an invasion: a ledger. An unpaid bill. A loan that was never realistically meant to be repaid in full, followed by soldiers who arrived not to conquer, but, officially, at least, to collect. This isn't a story about one empire or one villain. It's a mechanism used by multiple powers, in multiple centuries, that let entire nations be brought under foreign control while every document involved looked, on paper, like an ordinary contract between consenting parties. Welcome to the Financial Historian, where money, power, and history collide, and nothing is ever as simple as it looks. There's no better place to start than the one case where the mechanism is almost embarrassingly explicit, because the debt in question was created for the sole purpose of being impossible to escape. In 1804, after a brutal and successful uprising against slavery and French colonial rule, Haiti became the first nation in the modern world founded by formerly enslaved people. It should have been simply a country. Instead, in 1825, France sent a fleet to Haiti's coast and delivered an ultimatum: pay an enormous indemnity, compensation to former slaveholders for the loss of their human property, or face renewed war and a return to French control. Haiti, still recovering from its revolution and desperate to secure recognition from a hostile world, agreed. The sum demanded was so large that Haiti had to borrow from French banks just to make the very first payments, meaning the newly independent nation went into debt to the same country it had just fought a war of independence against, in order to pay reparations for the crime of having freed itself. Haiti continued servicing this debt, and the loans taken out to manage it, for well over a century, into the 1940s by some estimates. Economists and historians have since argued that this single financial arrangement diverted resources that could have funded schools, infrastructure, and institutions for generations, leaving lasting effects on the country's development that are still debated and felt today. Notice what happened here. No invasion was required after the initial threat. No occupying garrison needed to be stationed indefinitely. A number was set, a threat was made once, and then the debt itself did the ongoing work of control, quietly extracting resources for more than 100 years without a single additional shot being fired. If Haiti shows the mechanism in its rawest form, Egypt in the 19th century shows how the same trick could work through investment and infrastructure rather than open coercion. Egypt's ruler, Khedive Ismail, embarked in the 1860s and 1870s on an ambitious modernization campaign: railways, telegraph lines, and most famously, the Suez Canal, a project of genuine engineering brilliance that promised to transform global trade. The problem was how it got financed. Egypt borrowed heavily from European banks and investors to fund these projects, often on punishing terms, with lenders fully aware that a portion of the loan money never made it past the fees and discounts taken by the financiers arranging the deals. By the mid-1870s, Egypt's debts had become unmanageable, and the country was forced to sell its shares in the Suez Canal Company, ironically to the British government, which snapped up a controlling stake at a bargain price. When Egypt still couldn't service the remaining debt, European powers, principally Britain and France, imposed direct financial oversight over the Egyptian treasury, effectively placing European officials in charge of collecting Egyptian taxes to guarantee bondholders got paid. When local resistance to this arrangement grew into open unrest in 1882, Britain used the disorder as the pretext to invade militarily and occupy Egypt outright, an occupation that would last, in various forms, for another 70 years. The canal Egypt built to connect itself more fully to global commerce became the exact leverage point used to place the country under foreign control. The invasion, when it finally came, was almost an afterthought. The financial infrastructure of dependency had already been built years earlier, one bond issue at a time. If Egypt shows partial financial control, the Ottoman Empire shows just how far this mechanism could be extended without a single foreign soldier ever needing to occupy the capital. By 1881, decades of borrowing to fund wars, modernization, and an increasingly lavish court had left the Ottoman government unable to meet its debt obligations to European bondholders. Rather than seizing Ottoman territory outright, European creditor nations negotiated the creation of an institution called the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a body run largely by European bondholder representatives, given direct authority to collect specific Ottoman tax revenues, including levies on salt, tobacco, silk, and other goods, and channel that money straight to European creditors before it ever reached the Ottoman treasury itself. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because of how openly it inverted the usual relationship between a government and its own revenue. A sovereign empire, one that had ruled vast territories for centuries, effectively handed over the collection of some of its own taxes to an organization run by foreign financial interests, because the alternative, outright default, and the diplomatic and military consequences that might follow, was considered worse. The empire kept its flag, its sultan, and its formal independence. It simply no longer fully controlled its own money. By now a pattern should be emerging, one that connects nations as different as Haiti, Egypt, and the Ottoman Empire, separated by geography, culture, and circumstance, but bound by the exact same financial architecture. First, a debt is created, sometimes through outright coercion like Haiti's indemnity, sometimes through genuinely useful investment like Egypt's infrastructure projects, sometimes through the accumulated weight of decades of borrowing like the Ottoman case. Second, the debt grows to a size that cannot realistically be repaid under normal economic conditions, often because the terms were structured, deliberately or not, to guarantee this outcome. Third, rather than default being allowed to happen cleanly, foreign powers step in to help manage the crisis, typically by asserting direct or indirect control over the debtor nation's own revenue collection. And fourth, this financial control becomes the permanent arrangement, sometimes lasting far longer than any military occupation would have been politically tolerable to maintain. The genius of this mechanism, from the perspective of the powers who benefited from it, is that at every single stage, the paperwork looked entirely legitimate. Loans were signed voluntarily by recognized governments. Interest rates, however punishing, were contractual. Debt collection, however invasive, was framed as simply enforcing agreements that had been freely entered into. Colonization achieved through this method never had to justify itself as conquest. It could present itself as merely holding debtor nations to terms they themselves had agreed to, which made it enormously difficult, both at the time and in the historical memory that followed, to describe clearly as an act of domination at all. It's worth asking directly why this approach proves so much more durable, in many cases, than straightforward military conquest. Armies are expensive to maintain indefinitely, and military occupations tend to generate visible, organized resistance. An occupying force is an obvious target, both physically and morally, for a population that wants it gone. Debt control, by contrast, is nearly invisible to a distant observer and often difficult even for the affected population to fully perceive in real time. There's no foreign flag being raised over the capital. There's no occupying garrison to point to as the symbol of foreign domination. There's simply a treasury that somehow never has quite enough money left over after servicing its obligations abroad, year after year, for reasons that seem technical and impersonal rather than deliberate and political. This made debt-based control remarkably resistant to the kind of nationalist uprisings that eventually dismantled most formal colonial empires in the 20th century. It's very hard to organize a revolution against an interest rate. It's very hard to storm the palace of a bondholder committee headquartered in a bank in another country. The mechanism didn't just extract wealth efficiently. It was, in a structural sense, almost immune to the political resistance that direct military occupation reliably provoked. Here's where this history stops being a closed chapter and starts feeling uncomfortably relevant, because the underlying mechanism, a nation borrowing heavily, encountering a crisis it cannot manage alone, and then accepting external control over its own economic decisions as the price of assistance, didn't disappear when the age of formal European empires ended in the 20th century. When developing nations faced debt crises in the late 20th century, international financial institutions frequently extended new loans and debt relief on the condition of what came to be called structural adjustment, specific, externally dictated requirements around privatization, spending cuts, and economic policy that debtor governments had to accept as the price of continued access to credit. Defenders of this system argue, often with real justification, that these conditions were necessary responses to genuine fiscal irresponsibility and were intended to restore long-term economic stability. Critics argue that the outcome, regardless of the intent, has frequently mirrored the 19th century pattern strikingly closely, formerly independent nations retaining their flags and their governments, while key economic decisions are made under the close supervision of foreign creditors and international institutions, with limited practical alternative available to the debtor country. This isn't a claim that modern international lending is secretly identical to 19th century imperialism, and reasonable historians and economists disagree sharply about how directly comparable these systems really are. But the family resemblance between debt as the price of sovereignty in 1881 and debt as the price of continued access to capital in the modern era is close enough that it's worth understanding the older version clearly, if only to recognize the shape of the mechanism the next time it appears wearing a more contemporary name. If there's a genuinely useful lesson buried in these three very different national stories, it's this: sovereignty and solvency have never been as separate as most people assume. A nation can retain every formal marker of independence, its own government, its own flag, its own laws, while still losing effective control over its own economic decisions, simply because someone else holds the debt and sets the terms of repayment. Watch, in any era, for the moment a nation's revenue collection gets handed over, formally or informally, to an outside party as a condition of financial assistance. That handover, more than any change of flag, is usually the moment real control shifts hands. And watch for how completely legal, voluntary-sounding paperwork can be used to describe an arrangement that, from the debtor's actual position, offered essentially no real alternative to accepting it. Haiti paid for the right to have freed itself. Egypt built a canal that became the leverage used to take away its own treasury. The Ottoman Empire handed the collection of its own taxes to the very people it owed money to. In every case, the paperwork was clean, the contracts were technically voluntary, and the outcome was the same kind of foreign control that armies had always been used to achieve, just delivered through a method far harder to see coming and far harder to resist once it arrived. Conquest with cannons announces itself. Conquest with a ledger rarely does, and that may be exactly why it worked for so long, in so many places, for so many different empires, who all discovered, independently, the exact same trick. History doesn't repeat, but the bill it leaves behind has a way of finding new names for the same old debt. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.